Okay. All right. Welcome everybody to this November. No, it's not November. Yes, it is November. No, it's not. It's nearly. It's October. Welcome to this webinar. It's fantastic to have Zach Swiecki here with us today. Zach is an education researcher. He's focusing on collaboration analytics, such huge interest in collaboration and teamwork and collaborative problem solving. And so the challenge of how we're going to model collaboration is a very interesting one for us, either as a researchers studying collaborative problem solving or as learning analytics people interested in actually trying to automate that process as well and give feedback. So it's great to have Zach with us. Zach is currently in the US, but about to move to Melbourne, where he's taking up his new lectureship position at Monash University, which is exciting to see. So he's bringing together learning sciences, learning analytics, and human-computer interaction, which is a great mix, one close to my heart. So Zach, if you'd like to just share your screen so we can see that, then
get going here.
We'll get going. Zach's going to talk for about half an hour, and then we'll throw it open for the usual Q&A. So Zach, fantastic to have you with us, and over to you.
All right, just give me 1 second here. All right, this is working now for everybody?
Yep, that's great.
Awesome. Thank you, Simon, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for taking the time, whatever time it is in the world for you, to listen to this talk and this webinar. So today I'm going to be talking a bit about my work on modeling interdependence and collaborative problem solving. And most of this work was done as I was completing my dissertation at UW Madison in Wisconsin. But as Simon mentioned, I'm going to be moving on to Melbourne and at Monash University. So got to update the title slide and also throw an extra L in there so I can fit in. So as most of us know, collaborative problem solving is very important to society. So physicians work together to perform surgeries or diagnose illnesses. Engineers work together to design structurally sound buildings and other problems. And sports teams work together to win games and entertain crowds. With reference to learning in the learning sciences, there's a long history of collaboration as a key mechanism for learning. So this goes all the way back to Vygotsky's work on the zone of proximal development, and forward to Rochelle's work on joint problem spaces. And this work and a host of others argues that negotiating meaning and developing shared understandings contribute to learning, and that's a key process of collaboration and learning in general. So given the importance of collaboration and collaborative problem solving to learning, it's no surprise that there are several assessments that have been and are being developed of collaborative problem solving skills, both large and small scale. Large scale example is the PISA assessment that's relatively recent. But regardless of the kind of assessment, they all require models or some representation of the phenomena that's going on so that we can make predictions or test theories. And in general, there are kind of two ways to model collaboration, and those have to do with the level of analysis at which you're casting your focus. So we can look at the team as a whole, right? Treat that as the level of analysis and say what they do, irrespective of a particular individual. Or we can focus on a given individual and kind of isolate their actions and then say what they did. But obviously this is not that simple, because when people are on teams, they actually interact with one another. And this means that when they're interacting, they actually have to respond to and are influenced by others during collaboration. And that's generally what we mean by interdependence. And so in my work, for many years, I've argued that this is a critical thing to model in collaboration, but actually there aren't many techniques that can do this kind of modeling or account for this interdependence. So I'm going to talk a bit today about one model or one technique that can, epistemic network analysis, and I'll get into the details of that later. But as some of you may have run into, the issue with interdependent models, or ones that can account for interdependence like ENA does, compared to what I'm calling independent models, or those that isolate the actions of individuals in collaborative contexts, is that interdependent models tend to be more complex, both visually and computationally. So that's important because people actually use these models to do something. Researchers use them to get insights, teachers use them to plan interventions, teams use them as mirrors. And so what we found is that these independent models tend to be easier to understand in real time or use compared to interdependent models, which take some training and some experience to get used to. So what would be useful then is if we had some criteria that could help us decide when it was absolutely necessary to use an interdependent model and introduce that complexity, or when we could use an independent model. Other techniques like hierarchical linear models have such criteria, but there aren't ones for techniques like ENA or other interdependent models. So to talk about these criteria, we first need to get a little bit more specific about what we mean by interdependence. And to do that, I'm going to use an example from Hutchins' work on distributed cognition. So what Hutchins did is he studied the navigational practices of sailors in the Navy, the US Navy in the 90s. And in particular, he looked at one task of the sailors that was called position fixing. Right, so this is where sailors plot the position of a ship on the navigational chart, and they project the future positions of the ship. And they do this along with GPS calculations as a redundancy or a stopgap. So what they do is they plot the position by taking the bearing measurements or angle measurements between the forward line of motion of the ship and different landmarks in the vicinity. And the way that this works is there's someone on the team called the plotter who picks the landmarks that they're going to use for taking bearing measurements. And they relay those landmarks to the bearing recorder, who's another person on the team, who then relays that information to two others on the outer wings of the ship called the Polaris operators. And what they do is they actually take these angle measurements between the landmarks and the ship, and they do that using a tool called the Polaris. That's where they get their name. So once they get this information, they then relay that back to the bearing recorder, who records it and then passes that to the plotter so that that person can actually fix the position of the ship. And so we can see kind of how this unfolds when we look at a record of one example of talk on some of these teams, a very brief one. So here we have the bearing recorder introducing what the landmarks are that they're going to be taking bearing measurements from. The plotter tells which landmark to take first, the Point Loma one in this example. The bearing recorder repeats this information and then tells the Polaris operators to actually take the bearing. So that's what mark it there means. The Polaris operator takes his bearing measurement, relays that back to the other members of the team. Bearing recorder records that. The other Polaris operator does their bearing as well. So this brief example highlights several kinds of interdependence that we can talk about. The first is task interdependence. So when one component of the task requires other components to be completed. So here the Polaris operators can't actually get started until they know the landmarks, for example, or are told by the bearing recorder when to start. There's also this idea of discursive interdependence. So this is when either or both of information or behavior have to be coordinated between individuals in the collaborative setting. So here we have information being coordinated in terms of bearings and landmarks, but we also have actions and behaviors such as taking physical measurements with a tool, making communicative acts. And then we have this idea of temporal interdependence. So this has to do with when one kind of action in the team context makes other kinds more likely in the near future. So when the bearing recorder says to take the mark, it's very likely that the Polaris operator will then do that and record it. But more generally, for our purposes, this highlights an important thing about interdependence, that it's a microgenetic phenomenon. So it's unfolding moment by moment in the interactions between individuals in this context. There are also cognitive differences that we see. So different people talk about different things at different times. There's a level of social interaction or interspersion of the communication or discourse, right? And then there's this level of communication density. So even small discourse moves can have semantically meaningful content, sometimes different kinds of meaningful content in the same move. So to relate those ideas to these criteria for deciding between models, I conducted 4 studies to kind of get at this larger question that I'm going to go over today at a relatively high level. The first was, what drives interdependence in real scenarios? So what are the factors that contribute to it, which we've talked a little bit about already. Then can we measure the impact of interdependence? Can we see when it's going to have an effect? Then say we can measure it, but does it actually matter if it's there or not? So in other words, how sensitive are results to the impact of interdependence? If we account for it, does it change the decisions or conclusions that we would draw? And then getting more directly to these criteria, can we predict or estimate the impact of interdependence under a variety of conditions? So the first study I'm going to gloss over a bit because it's a qualitative study and in-depth qualitative study of two real data sets. One data set was the Tabness Dataset, which many of you have heard me speak about before. So in this data, teams participated in training scenarios that simulated them being on warships, and they used radar to detect aircraft or other vessels in the vicinity and decide whether they were friendly or hostile, or whether they should be engaged in combat or just warned away. In this context, these were called tracks. You'll see that pop up a couple of times. So in this data, there were 16 teams in total and 109 individuals. 8 of those teams were in a control condition and 8 were in an experimental condition. The experimental condition had access to a more sophisticated radar system that helped them to manage their collaborative efforts, hopefully better than the control condition. And the actual data were transcripts of their radio communications as they worked together on these problems. So to conduct my analysis, I used a set of codes to investigate the transcripts, and these captured salient concepts in the team decision-making process. So things like seeking information, passing information about track behavior, giving orders, or to warn or attack tracks. And broadly, what my analysis found is that those individuals in the control condition tended to seek information about track behavior, detection, and assessment, while those individuals in the experimental condition tended to respond to information about track behavior and detection with orders, recommendations, and status updates. And this will become important in our further studies. More broadly, though, this analysis confirmed that interdependence was happening at this microgenetic level between the interactions of individuals, as was evidenced by their communications. We saw cognitive differences between individuals. Certain people said things that other people didn't, or said less likely. There was a high level of social interaction, so people intersperse their communication a lot in this context. And even small pieces of discourse could have semantically meaningful content in them. So I conducted a similar analysis in a second real data set, and this was the Nefertex data set, and some of you might be familiar with that. It's an educational simulation in which students play the role of interns at a biomedical engineering company. And this takes place all online, and they use a tool to conduct their research and do their teamwork. They have a chat tool where they communicate with one another. And they also have a design tool where their main task is to design a hemodialysis machine for kidney patients with kidney failure. And they do that by picking certain inputs and relating them to certain outputs like cost or patient health, and use that to judge the performance of their designs. So in this data, we had 12 internships that I looked at. There were 5 teams per internship and a total of 300 individuals. I also had a record of their individual engineering notebooks, which recorded their design justifications, and these were used to classify the individuals as high or low performers. And I had the chat logs from their communications throughout the internship. These were coded for salient aspects of the design process for them. So things like justifications or rationales in terms of customer requests or performance requirements, and also particular design moves like experimental testing or holding things constant. And these codes were developed by a former person in the Epistemic Analytics Lab, Goal, who I don't think is here because she just had a baby, but congratulations to her. Overall, my analysis of this data suggested 2 things. Those in the low performers justified design choices in terms of customer and consultant requests, and those in the high performing context facilitated decision-making process via communication and asking questions, and they also made design choices in relation to experimental moves. Again, we saw that there was a microgenetic thing going on here. There were cognitive differences between individuals. There was a level of social interaction and a level of communication density. So this is all good. It suggests that interdependence is driven by some differences in cognitive and social and communicative structures, but it's limited as a qualitative study. What would be nice is if we could get a quantitative grip on whether or not or how interdependence is happening here. And so for that, I turned to my second study where I developed a measure of the impact of interdependence. And I did this by developing what I'm calling the Interdependence Index, or the ITI. So how this works is it compares independent and interdependent model results to see how different they are and determine whether there's an impact of interdependence on the data, excuse me. So I did this in particular using ENA. It's theoretically possible to use other methods, but I chose ENA for a variety of reasons, which we can discuss later. First, we have to do an independent model using ENA. And what that means is we're going to take a record of the discourse. This is from the naval context. And for a given individual, we're going to pull out their lines. And because it's an independent model, we're going to just look within their lines and see whether or not there are connections in those lines by themselves, not in relation to each other, just within each line. So in this example, the only line with connections in it is this one. It has these three codes here and would form those connections. So we can do this for all this individual's lines and all individuals in the data. And what we end up getting is a vector representation of a given individual that shows the relative frequency with which they had each of these connections. This is what actually ends up going into ENA to make the network diagrams, but we're not at that point yet. So we can also do a slightly different process by using an interdependent model with ENA. And so this is different in the sense that we find the lines associated with a given individual. And instead of just looking at those lines, we put a window around them so that it includes the lines and contributions both from the person themselves and from other people on the team. And this window gets moved through the data. And as it does, we're able to identify connections that occur within the window. So here we're seeing connections in the individual of interest, the last person in this window, to their own talk prior, and also to the talk or contributions of others on the team. So, and this is what we mean by accounting for interdependence among teammates within this temporal context using ENA. So this also produces a vector representation like the one before, except the process by which it did it was different. And it gives us an interdependent vector for a given individual. And for the same individual, we have their independent vector. And now what we want to do is see how different these are, right? So what we can do is calculate the correlation between them, or the cosine of the angle between them. It's the same thing. And this is what I'm calling the ITI, or the Interdependence Index. So since it's a correlation measure, if it equals 1, this means that these models are very similar. But the farther it gets away from 1, it means they're very different, and that there's an impact of interdependence there. So if we collect together all these measures for all the individuals in a given data set, say, we can do statistical tests to see if on average there's a statistical or significant impact of interdependence in this data. And so we can do that using linear models, in this case, a mixed model. What we're doing is we're predicting that ITI value based on the intercept, which corresponds to the average ITI controlling for team effects. And what we're interested in doing is comparing this to some threshold, some ITI or correlation threshold, say 0.9, a very high one, meaning similar models. So if we calculate this average here and we see that it's the upper bound of its confidence interval is below our threshold, we'd say that interdependence is impactful and statistically significant. However, if it's above that threshold, we would say that it's not impactful. So here are the results of a model like this for the Tabness Dataset. So we can see that it's a significant predictor. The intercept is significant. One caveat here is that because these are correlations, in order to do these tests, we have to transform them back to the correlation scale. I've put that on the right there, so I would pay attention to that. So here we're seeing that the confidence interval around this value here, this ITI value, is 0.51 to 0.64. And that's well below 0.9, suggesting that this was a significant result and significantly impacted by interdependence. We see something similar for the Nefertex data, though the value is higher, so it's much closer to our threshold, 0.74 to 0.87. So from this, I concluded that yes, we can get a handle on the impact of interdependence in our data. We do that by operationalizing the ITI as correlations between interdependent and independent models. So now we want to see whether or not this matters, right? So how sensitive are results to this impact? Will we get different conclusions if we account for interdependence versus not? And this will help us decide whether or not we should use it, right? To do this, we have to kind of pick our horse to place our bets on. We have to find a gold standard model or decide on which one's our gold standard model. And one way that that's done, and the way that I did that in this study, was I compared these models to a qualitative grounded story or understanding of the data and the phenomena that was going on. So in other words, I looked for the convergence of either of these models with the qualitative findings that I found before. Once you've done that, you can settle on your model, and you can say that if there are differences between groups in your model and they have a certain effect size, if we were to change the model or go to an independent model from an interdependent model, for example, and see a different effect size, we can see whether or not these are statistically different and see whether there were quantitative differences between these approaches. So here I'll be referring to some more traditional ENA representations of networks and ENA scores that hopefully many of you have seen. So if we go back to our Tabness qualitative result, we saw that the control individuals sought information about track behavior detection and assessment. The experimental ones responded to that information with orders, recommendations, status updates. So that would suggest that the control condition individuals would have stronger connections between these codes in the study, and the experimental condition would have stronger connections between these codes. We can actually compare this hypothesis, this qualitative hypothesis, to the quantitative model. So here's the interdependent network for all the control condition versus the experimental condition for the Tabness data. And we can see that this model aligns quite well with the story, right? Particularly for the control group, we see stronger connections between seeking information, detection, track behavior, and assessment on the left. And on the right, we see stronger connections between status updates, different kinds of orders, and detection and track behavior. If we do the same thing for the independent model, things move around a bit, but pieces of the story are the same, right? So on the experimental side, we still see some of those connections between orders, recommendations, track behavior, and detection. But importantly, on the control condition side, we're missing a piece of the story there, right? So we're not seeing stronger connections between seeking information, detection, and track behavior for the control group. There's no line there, actually, which suggests that the model found no difference. So this independent model is missing a key conclusion of our qualitative analysis that we found before. In terms of the quantitative difference, we can look at the statistical differences between the two conditions, experimental and control, and look at the effect size of those differences. That's Cohen's F column there. The interdependent model had a higher effect size than the independent model, but the confidence intervals around those overlap. So that suggests that the effect is not actually statistically different. We can do a similar thing for the Nefertex data. So remember, the low performing students justify design choices in terms of customer and consultant requests. High performers looked at decision-making in relation to asking questions and communication, and also experimental testing. So that would suggest that these are going to be the connections that are most prominent in the networks. So for the interdependent model, this aligns well again. We see on the left, the customer and consultant requests to making design choices. On the right, we see those connections for the high performers in terms of design choices, communication, et cetera. When we look at the independent model, things shift a bit, but if we look carefully, things are largely the same. On the left, on the low side, we have the, for the low performers, the customer and consultant request is on the left. Those are actually all red lines connected to that. They're very faint. I didn't have time to inflate all of our values here so we could see that more easily, but there are stronger connections between customer consultant requests and making design choices for the low group. And those connections on the high group also exist in this model. So looking at the quantitative results, again, we see that there's no statistical difference between the effect sizes of these two models. So in conclusion, neither of the results had effect sizes that changed significantly. So the quantitative result was essentially the same, but the interpretation of that result for the Tabness data changed more between the interdependent and independent models compared to the Nefertex result. So it was more sensitive in terms of its interpretation. And to kind of explain that, we can think back to those ITI confidence intervals that we calculated previously. The Tabness data had lower ITI values, suggesting that it had a greater impact of interdependence than the Nefertex data, which was very close to that threshold that we had established. So in sum there, we found that results may be more sensitive when the impact of interdependence is greater. So moving now directly to this idea of getting criteria for choosing between these models, we want to know if we can predict or estimate the impact of interdependence under a variety of conditions. And so you might be wondering, well, didn't we already do that? We have this ITI measure, which measures this impact. Can't we just use that? And we could, of course, but there's a drawback to it in the sense that it requires running two ENA models and comparing them. It would be much better if we had a more general approach that accounted for this phenomena that didn't necessarily require ENA to be used. So what we want then is some way to estimate the independent vector and estimate the interdependent vector, and then compare those and get the estimated ITI. So first, I'll walk through how I did that with the independent estimate. The first thing we want to do is calculate a co-occurrence matrix for a given individual. So here we're counting the co-occurrences that occur in their data and dividing it by the number of lines for each individual. And then we're going to unwrap that into a vector and normalize it. And so in a way, this is operationalizing this idea of communication density because it's accounting for the fact that individuals can have multiple codes appearing in their lines. For the interdependent estimate, we take the same thing that we had before. We'll save that for later. But now we also need to account for the rest of the team because we're thinking about interdependence here. So we need this team occurrence matrix. And what this does is it counts up the number of code occurrences just by themselves, dividing by the number of lines for each individual. And this operationalizes this idea of cognitive differences. So it shows the different rates for different concepts on the team across individuals. We also need some information about the social structure of the team, and that's where the social matrix comes in for this estimate. So here we find the number of times each individual is in a window of whichever size you want with another individual. And so this will show the social structure of the team or how interspersed their talk is within the windows. So now to actually get this vector, we have to do a little bit of math, which I'll gloss over, but I can talk about in more detail. So what we're going to do is for a given pair of codes, multiply the code probabilities times the window probabilities of the individual that we're creating the vector for. And we'll do that for both of the codes in the pair that we consider. Then we'll find the union of those probabilities. And this is going to give the probability of the individual having that connection from A to B, either in their own lines or in the lines that are in their windows. So then we can normalize that and repeat that for all the pairs of codes that we have. And then we're done with this estimate. So what we can now do now that we have an estimate of the independent vector and the interdependent vector is correlate those just like we did before to get this estimated ITI. And for real data, what we're interested in is how well does that predict the actual ITI? How close are we getting? Are we getting a significant relationship? So for the Tabness data, we can see that the estimate is a strong and significant positive predictor of the ITI. And the overall relationship is quite strong according to the R-squared values. For the Nefertex data, we also have a significant result and it's positive, but the relationship is not quite as strong, more of a lower R-squared. So this is nice. We seem to have a impact estimate that we can use on real data to help potentially make some decisions between interdependent and independent models. But these are only 2 data sets, right? So what would be more useful is if we were able to try under a variety of conditions the same process and relate those to what makes those conditions different as a way to generalize the results. And so to do that, we need to simulate some team data. So I'm going to talk briefly about how I simulated collaboration data and used it to test this ITI estimate. So overall, the goal of the simulation process is to produce some data that's at least in structure a lot like the data that we typically use in quantitative ethnographic analyses. It has units, it has groups, it has codes, right? In order to do this, there are going to be 4 steps that I'm going to go over. And I'll talk about these steps in terms of, say, one team's data, one simulated team's data. Again, simulated people, not real people. The first thing we want to do is line generation. So what this is going to do is generate the sequence of lines in the data and also the number of lines for each simulated individual. So the way that we do that is we have one of these team social interaction matrices again. We choose the diagonal values here, which represent the probability, for example, that when unit 1 has a line, the next line in the data will be from unit 1. So that's what the 0.5 is. When unit 2 has a line, the next line in the data has an 80% chance of being from unit 2, for example. And I'll talk about why we choose these particular values in a moment. Then we choose the off-diagonal values so that the rows sum to 1, right? And so if you may have caught on that this is basically just a state transition diagram or a lag1 Markov chain. And since it's that, we can actually run that and generate the sequence of lines for our simulated data. So say we want to do 3,000 lines, we can start with the first person, run the Markov chain 1,000 times and get an order of those lines. Start with the second person now, run it 1,000 times. Start with the third person 1,000 times. And now we have the order that we want our data to be in, and we also have a record of how many lines are associated with each individual on the simulated team. So partway there, now we need to distribute the codes amongst those lines in a principled way. Could put them randomly, but that wouldn't be very helpful. So to do this, we have a complete code occurrence vector that we're going to create. So it tells the rate at which all of the possible co-occurrences occur in a given individual's lines. So here we have a co-occurrence matrix. Again, we pick the diagonal, and this diagonal of this matrix has to do with it's just the probability of them having that code in their data. I'll talk about why we pick these particular values in a moment. Then we multiply to get the off-diagonal values. So for the A-B co-occurrences, we multiply A and B, A and C, B and C, etc. Then we can unwrap that into a vector. And then we're missing one piece. We want to concatenate on the overall probability of getting A, B, and C in your data so that we can completely fill out our lines with each of these categories. And then we take this vector and we multiply it by the number of lines from the Markov sequence that actually were assigned to this individual that we're looking at. So what that's going to produce is another vector essentially that says how many lines have each of these combinations of codes. So in this example, one line for this person has A, B, and C. 28 lines have A and B. 14 have A and C, etc. So that gives us a simulated team data set for one team, right? That's nice, but we actually want to do this for multiple teams and capture some of the variance in these parameters that we're talking about, right? So that's where the parameter variation step comes in, so that we can get multiple data sets for a given set of parameters for different teams. So to do that, we have our social matrix, and we pick its diagonal and its off diagonals, as I said before. But now if we want to kind of mess with or alter the social structure of this team, for example, this matrix is going to say for unit 1, there's a 50% chance that the next line is from unit 1, a 25% chance it's from unit 2, 25% chance it's from unit 3, for example. Say we altered that to have ones all along the diagonal. So this would mean a social difference of 0 for this team, and that every line, when a given individual has a line, they're only followed by their own lines, right? They never have any interspersion of communication or discourse. We can increase this number to say 0.5, so we get more interspersion of discourse. People's lines are occurring within their others' windows. And we can actually increase it all the way if we wanted, so that anytime someone had a line, the next line would always be from someone else in the simulated data. So this represents the highest level of interaction in the simulated data. We can do kind of a similar thing for the cognitive structure of the team. So if we take their co-occurrence matrix, choose a diagonal for one particular individual on the team, then we have other individuals on that team, and we want to set it up so that their co-occurrence rates on average are not different from each other, or differ by a specific value, which I'm calling the cognitive difference value. So for a cognitive difference value of 0, everyone would have the same co-occurrence rates on the team, and then they would get the same rates for the other values as well. Then we can vary this cognitive difference value to make different organizations of cognitive structure on the team. So people talking about different things on the same team. So once we have that, we can accumulate the data for a set of parameters and then run this process as many times as we want to get large data sets that have different collections of social and cognitive difference values. Once we do that, we can calculate the actual ITI, and I'm wrapping up here. I've got a couple minutes left. And then we can calculate the estimated ITI and compare those again using a linear model. Except this time we're going to compare the ITI that we get from doing ENA to the estimate, and also control for the social and cognitive differences and team effects. So here's what a run of the simulation would look like. On the y-axis, we have the average ITI value. On the x-axis, we have the social difference values. And here I'm showing you one run, or set of runs, excuse me, for a cognitive difference of 0, meaning that all the individuals in the simulated team had the same rates for codes and co-occurrences. So what this is showing is that when people talk about the same things or have the same distribution of talk, it doesn't matter how much you intersperse their talk with each other in their windows. They stay relatively stable in terms of the impact of interdependence. It stays close to 1. Right? And that makes sense because they're not they might be talking to different people, but different people aren't talking about different things, so it's not going to show up as being impactful in the model. However, if we look at a cognitive difference level that's higher, say 0.5, we can start to see some differences or impact of interdependence. So this is suggesting that when you have cognitive differences and you increase your social difference, so people say different things and talk to different people, the impact of interdependence is going to be high, and you should consider using an interdependent model. So the regression that I showed previously supports that. We can see that the ITI estimate is again significantly predictive of the actual ITI, and also the cognitive and social differences are predictive of the ITI. So as those the ITI values decrease as you increase your cognitive difference and social difference values, meaning you get a higher impact of interdependence. Okay, so this suggests that we can predict the impact of interdependence for real and simulated data using an estimate that operationalizes socio and cognitive differences or structures on the team. And to wrap up here, we'll talk about some contributions of this work. First, we found that there are differences in cognitive and social structures that can drive interdependence. And we saw that both qualitatively in the first study and quantitatively here with the last regression that we saw. We can also measure the impact of interdependence via the ITI, which right now is dependent on ENA, but could theoretically be implemented with other models. We saw that results may be sensitive to the impact of interdependence, so it can matter. These decisions between interdependent and independent models can have significant decisions or impacts on your decisions about what you say about your data and the conclusions you draw. We can predict the impact of interdependence on real and simulated data without using ENA, but using this estimation procedure. And perhaps most importantly, we have a simulation procedure that can be used to test a variety of hypotheses about collaboration. We could use the simulated data that our procedure that I have here to test how other models might be sensitive, other models than ENA might be sensitive to interdependence, for example, or how sequence or the ordering sequential models might be sensitive to this team structure or cognitive structure, or just a couple of examples. And also importantly, this work shows that there are these two important techniques that I think that should be more part of our toolkit in general when we're studying the learning sciences and also learning analytics. And those are sensitivity analyses and simulation studies. And hopefully this has shown an example of how those might be done and also shown the kind of questions that they can be applied to. Okay, so that's all I have, and I'm happy to take some questions and comments.
Okay. Virtual applause from around the world, Zach. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I can stop sharing now so we can just look at me.
Yeah, okay. Right. Well, that was coming at us for at 8 a.m. for me here in Sydney. That was quite an avalanche as I get into my day. So, folks, have we got some questions for clarification or you know, asking for some comments here? Have you seen work like this before? Were there things in there that you'd like some clarification on? You can unmute your mic and stick your hand up using the control panel on the participant window. So, does anybody want to kick us off here? I mean, as a general comment, Zach, I think it's fantastic to see, you know, a controlled comparison, you know, of coding and counting against modeling interdependence, and the way that you've done that seems very elegant. To do that and operationalize the differences that you get when you introduce interdependence. So that seems like a very nice sort of framework and toolkit to do that ENA is offering us.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to point out is that my implementation of this used ENA, but again, it's theoretically possible to use other techniques to calculate this metric. And the simulation procedure doesn't actually use ENA as well. So that's just a separate procedure that can be used to test things separate from ENA. So it has kind of a broader, hopefully, impact for lots of different models and studies. Right.
And for someone like myself, I'm coming in probably from a more qualitative kind of background, actually. The idea of simulating a data set is maybe quite a novel one for some people here. You know, that you're going to simulate a conversation in a sense in order to try and test your model. That's not something we see very often in the qualitative fields, for sure, right? It's like, well, how can you simulate a dialogue, right? But of course, yeah, you know, you're doing it in a very particular way, but that methodologically, that's a new kind of thing to do. And I'm working with a machine learning researcher who is, you know, simulating reflective writing. And I'm like,
Mhm.
what do you mean simulating reflective writing? And of course, he's not actually simulating writing. He's simulating certain features in the
Correct.
data
Yeah.
set that he wants to model, right?
Yes.
But that's one of those things that folks who are not used to seeing this, you know, are going to go, what? How are we doing this? And that's one of those interesting transdisciplinary things that needs that's new for anyone coming from a qual background, I would think.
Yeah, definitely. I saw that David and Carl had a virtual and real hand raised. I don't know who's
Okay.
first though.
Okay.
Well, I have a comment actually on what Simon just said. So maybe I'll do that instead of asking my question, and then Carl can go. So, you know, I think one of the things that this illustrates is the way in which, you know, part of what quantitative ethnography does is it forms a link between a qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis, and kind of the pivot, the place where they connect is the codes, right? And that the codes are sort of the means of translating between those two. So what Simon, what you just said really illustrates that nicely, in the sense that we can't actually simulate qualitative data. But if we accept that the qualitative data is coded in particular ways, we can simulate the pattern of codes, even if we don't have the precise data to go with it. And that's sort of part of that, part of the way in which these two techniques meet at the point of the codes.
I would also add, David, to that. I think that in addition to the codes, thinking about these data generating aspects, right? So things that we hypothetically, or from the literature, from our grounded understanding, generate these kinds of structures in the data. And in addition to the codes, those actually get operationalized as well and are essentially what you're using to do the simulation and the test. And I think that meeting point is very important too, and probably, I think, the hardest thing to think about and decide upon and implement when you're doing things like this.
Yeah. Okay. I can see that Zichang Kai, you had a question, so go for it.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, Zach. Great presentation. I really like it, and that was such a wonderful one. I have just one thing that I want to ask you is about dependency and interdependency. When you make this difference, basically you extracted individual utterances out of the data set for each individual as independent model. And then if you use, I'm thinking if you use the same window size, say 5 utterances, and the 5 utterances for a single individual may cover a long period of time or a big part of a task. Say it could be tens of a task. But 5 utterances from a group of people may cover just 1/30 of a task. So that makes the information different. So you basically, that's a, if we are just say the task. One is you are talking about just one tenth of a task. The other is talking about 1/3 of a task. So the information is not equivalent. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, so there's one clarification that I would make in that the way that I implemented the independent model, the window is actually, it's using a window model, but it's only ever the size of 1. So it only ever looks at one contribution, right? And then through the ENA process, it'll accumulate the connections based on the ones that occurred in those individual lines. Then in the independent model, there is a window, say of 5 or say whatever you determine to use for your window, and that will include other information from the group. And I think in order to be sensitive to your comment, that decision has to be made carefully about how big to make that interdependent window. Is 5 enough, or do you need more, or do you need less? But the independent one has to be 1 window in order to just isolate that individual's connections.
one thing I wanted to see if I could jump in here too, Zach. I think one of the pieces that I think you and Carl were just discussing, and I think Simon and David touched on, is the role that qualitative analyses can play, or the ethnographic pieces can play in this type of work, is that you can actually, by operationalizing and defining things in the way that you have, you can start to say, these are the types of things that qualitative researchers should be attending to. I think you touched on this when you talked about bringing things from theory, right? And I think what's beneficial about taking this approach to do both sensitivity analyses, but also the simulation studies more broadly, is that then we can see how much of an impact that could have, right? Like it's expensive often to collect the data and do these analyses, but if we can do some of this work to try to say, these are the features that I want to key in on, and I think a key tenet of quantitative ethnography is being able to try to find ways to quantify those and build models based on them. And I think without taking that approach, we don't avail ourselves of this toolkit of doing simulation studies or sensitivity analyses. It would take much longer to understand some of these phenomenon, or even design tools like you've done with the ITI to try to get at them to see, does this matter or not? Is this worth attending to? So I just really appreciate highlighting a lot of those pieces.
Yeah, I mean, the QE perspective, I think, is essential to doing good simulation studies, because you want to have principled data generation mechanisms to use. You don't want to just use anything and see what happens, right? So I picked ones like social and cognitive differences that are both from the theory, like that's something that Dillenberg talked about as symmetry and asymmetry and communication, right? But also I saw that was occurring in my data qualitatively. I saw that people talked about different things. In some cases they had roles, so that meant that they almost by definition talked about different things than others. And then I saw that they actually interspersed or had different social structures as well, right? And so then, you know, the idea comes, well, are these related to this idea of interdependence, right?
That just sparks a comment. I mean, so what you were asking there, Brendan, was being able to run a simulation allows you to ask, is this analysis even worth doing? Perhaps manually, qualitatively, because that's going to be expensive. That's what I heard you asking, right? I mean, we could spend a lot of valuable researcher time doing this analysis to establish a gold standard, but is it even worth doing? That's what I think you're asking. I mean, that sparked the thought that maybe you would run a simulation before you do your real data gathering, because you want to know, is it worth generating data of this sort so that we could do this analysis afterwards? Does that make sense? So supposing
it does, yeah.
There are design decisions to make about the learning environment or about what you're going to capture.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about it that way. I was reading Brendan's comment as the other way around, so that it could take a lot of time to develop these quantitative mechanisms for the simulation. And so you'll save yourself time and actually effort in a different place if you ground yourself in the data and the theory in order to decide what to use to conduct the simulation. And I mean, in my view, the simulation is useful for kind of generalizability, is the way that I think about it. So it's a way to, in a given context, we saw these things. Now, what happens if we find the important things in these contexts, and then we broaden the range of how they happen and how they interact, and what is that going to tell us? Because we expect that those broader range of actions might actually occur out in the wild. I think the other way could be interesting too, particularly if you already had some simulation and you wanted to see if you should collect more data to see if you need something, if something is aligning, like, oh, well, okay, let's collect some more data and see this. So I think it's kind of you need both. You shouldn't just do one or the other.
Yeah, I guess I intended both. I was kind of thinking about both. So I'm glad that Simon, you'd given voice to that part too. I think anyways, I don't want to take too much more airtime, but yeah, those are both kind of what I was thinking.
Okay. Anyone else want to chip in? David, I think you had a thought. Do you want to lob that one in?
Well, I have two as usual. One is just a response to what you were just saying, which is, I hadn't really thought about this before, but in one of the things we talk about in my lab, and I think is sort of part of the broader discourse of quantitative ethnography, is this idea of a smoking gun, right? So when you're trying to think about how you want to collect data, how you want to construct an argument, even sometimes how you want to code, I try and think about, well, what is the piece of data or pieces of data? What's the situation that I could see in the world that we would take as being, really strong evidence for the phenomenon that we're interested in? And it strikes me that you could actually think about either figuring out whether a smoking gun is really smoking, or where you might go to look for a smoking gun by running a simulation study. That is, you're imagining a piece of data, right?
Yeah.
And now the question is, would that data be dispositive? And you could actually answer that in a simulation before you even went out and tried to gather that particular kind of data, or along the way, or something like that. The question I had was a lot simpler though, which was, so I'm assuming, first of all, I'm assuming that you're going to boil some of this down to practice. So there'll be an R package or something where people will just be able to put their data in and get out their ITI or something like that. But, but even before that, I'm assuming most of the folks in this conversation, right, are probably not going to run the simulations, the R code for the simulation studies themselves. Are there some big take homes from all of this? I'm thinking along the lines of not the kind of contributions, but do we know when we should start worrying about interdependence, kind of as a general matter, or what would be your best advice to somebody if they didn't want to actually take on all of this computational machinery?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, it's on the surface it's a simple question, but it's actually kind of a nuanced one. But in general, I would say that first you can do the ITI approach without conducting the full simulation if you wanted to. You can calculate that metric and compare it to a correlation threshold that you are comfortable exceeding or not, and that's fine. But where the simulation helps is in terms of these mechanisms that might be driving that. And so what that's telling me is that you can calculate things that the simulation uses on your data set regardless, and it suggests that as people talk more with other people in their data, or interact more with other people, doesn't have to be talking, and those individuals are talking about different things, right? The more that's happening, the more you should be considering or worrying about interdependence. And the other thing I would say is that there's not really a high cost, at least the cost is relatively small for you to use the interdependent model and not the independent model. What you're paying there is a complexity cost, right? There's the trade-off there. It's harder to understand and maybe to explain, right? But the other way around, I think, is worse. You're potentially harming your validity if you use an independent model when you should be using an interdependent one. But that is a trade-off that's made in lots of modeling cases. People decide to use HLMs instead of LMs or not based on criteria, right, about their data, and that's what I'm trying to get at. So, but the basic idea is that if you suspect that there's a lot of interaction about, and people say different things than other people, you want to be using your interdependent model.
Okay. Zach, in the sort of final 5 minutes or so, I was wondering whether you could reflect on what kind of response this kind of work gets from related communities, and you can define who those related communities would be. But obviously, there are whole communities who study teamwork and science of teamwork. There are whole communities who study collaborative problem solving. What kinds of responses does this kind of work get from them? Are they confused, excited? Is this revolutionary? Do they say, nothing new here? Have you got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think about it a lot, and I will say that a lot of this work, at least that I'm presenting here with the simulation stuff, is relatively new, and I'm just getting some of these ideas out there. So I'm interested to see how people are reacting. But just in my general experience, I think that with all QE endeavors, there's you're trying to cater to multiple audiences who aren't fluent in one or the other pieces of the things that the audience cares about, right? So a lot of what I run into, and I suspect that this probably happened in this presentation as well, is that I'm using relatively sophisticated quantitative ideas and also relatively sophisticated qualitative ideas. And people are paying attention to those differently and understanding them differently. And it kind of makes the whole package harder to grok on at the same time. And so I think that's a challenge. And so I think that really focusing on, and I think this is something we can all do a good job of, is really focusing on the links between what the real phenomena is and what the operationalized version is, right? And how that's happening and how that's getting played out. And that seems to be the best way to kind of toe that line, but to help people from both camps understand. So yeah, that's something that I think we're all struggling with a bit.
Yes, it's a fascinating challenge for me, I think, about how communities can, when they've come across something new and exciting like this, how they start to engage the different stakeholders who are sitting around from the outside.
Yep.
Certain bits of what you say will resonate and make sense immediately to different groups in the audience, and then the rest they're going, what did he do there? And
right.
and I guess you could just say, well, there's no alternative except to spend time talking and in dialogue, and so people can check their assumptions and ask for clarifications. But as a community, we have to learn how to tell those stories in ways tuned to different audiences, I guess.
Yeah, and just to add one thing on that, and then I'll be done. I think one thing that the community is doing a good job of, and I think can continue to do, is to use these ideas to make actual tools that people can use, right? So David mentioned about this getting implemented as an R package, right? And so that's a different kind of dialogue or different kind of interaction with folks who then see what this might be useful for and then can try it out on their own and investigate it without necessarily that back and forth that is very valuable, but might not be able to happen all the time. So to the extent that we can take these ideas and package them, metaphorically and actually into tools that can be used by others who have different research questions or ideas, I think can help that issue greatly.
Right. Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of encapsulating ideas like this into practical tools. I guess the flip side of that is the risk that someone is pulling stuff off the shelf and loading this R package, a bit like folks are pulling machine learning algorithms off and just throwing them at their data and hoping something interesting is going to come out, and not understanding what they're doing as well. And there may be no shortcuts to this, but giving people the chance to play with data, find something that looks interesting, and then go, okay, I really need to understand this, because that's a different way of working with data, but it's one that data science opens up for us now. A more exploratory mode, a bit like exploratory visualization tools, which by just messing around sometimes with different thresholds and so forth, suddenly something looks interesting, and then you start to drill in. Okay, right. Well, we should wrap up there. Let's just thank Zach one more time for this work. There's a huge amount there. It's great that his work is now getting out there in some great peer-reviewed journals and so forth, and conferences, and that will start to pick up momentum. So thank you, Zach. Next month we have Brian Wu from East China Normal University. Due to the time zones changing, that is going to be at a different time from usual. It could be 3 p.m. CST, I think, if we've got our calendars right. But still 8 a.m. here in Australia. So we'll see you next month, but thanks very much, everybody, for coming along, and thank you very much to Zach for today's webinar.
Thank you.